7, 1945. Somewhere in Bavaria, near the Austrian border. First Lieutenant James Harmon sat on the running board of a disabled German half-track, watching American soldiers celebrate in the street of a village whose name he'd already forgotten. They were firing rifles into the air. Someone had found schnapps. Another man was waving a Nazi flag like a trophy. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. Victory. Harmon was 24 years old. He'd landed at Normandy with the 29th Infantry Division on June 7, 1944, one day after D-Day. He'd fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, survived the Battle of Saint-Lô, crossed the Moselle River, pushed into the Rhineland, witnessed the liberation of a concentration camp, and watched 187 men from his original company die. Out of 211 who'd crossed the beach in France, only 24 remained. The celebration in the street grew louder. Someone started singing. Others joined in. The sound echoed off the half-timbered buildings lining the cobblestone street. Harmon didn't move. He couldn't. The weight pressing down on his chest made breathing difficult. Not physical weight, something else. Something he had no words for. A private named Kowalski approached with a bottle. "Lieutenant, you gotta celebrate with us. We did it. We beat the bastards." His face was flushed with alcohol and relief. He looked 17. He was 19. He joined the company in February after the Ardennes. He hadn't seen what Harmon had seen. "I'm good," Harmon said. His voice sounded flat. "Empty." Kowalski didn't notice. "Come on, sir. This is history. We won." He pushed the bottle toward Harmon's hand. Harmon took it, held it, stared at the label he couldn't read. German words. He handed it back without drinking. "Go celebrate, Kowalski. You earned it." The private shrugged and rejoined the group. Someone had started a bonfire using furniture pulled from a German administrative building. Black smoke rose into the spring air. The smell of burning wood mixed with gasoline and cordite. The smell of war still lingering even in victory. Harmon looked at his hands. They were shaking. They'd been shaking since Dachau. 3 weeks earlier, the division had reached the concentration camp. The smell had hit them first, before they saw the barracks or the bodies or the walking skeletons who stared at them with eyes that held no hope, only emptiness. The guards had fled. What remained was evidence of something that Harmon's brain still couldn't fully process. He'd seen death before. He'd seen men torn apart by artillery, burned alive in tanks, drowned in rivers. He'd killed German soldiers, shot them, watched them fall, moved on to the next objective. That was war. Brutal but comprehensible. What he'd seen at Dachau wasn't war. It was something else. Something that made the word victory feel wrong in his mouth. In the street, the singing continued. "When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah." Young voices full of relief and joy. The war was over. They'd survived. They were going home. Harmon wasn't sure he could go home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Home was a place where people smiled and asked how you were and expected normal conversation. Home was where his mother would hug him and his father would shake his hand and his younger sister would want to hear stories about being a hero. Home was where neighbors would slap his back and strangers would buy him drinks and everyone would say, "Thank you for your service," like those words meant something. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd watched too much die and done things he'd never be able to wash off. The sun was setting. Long shadows stretched across the cobblestones. The celebrations were spreading. More American troops were arriving from other positions, hearing the news, joining the party. Someone had found a phonograph. Glenn Miller music drifted from a doorway. Normal sounds. Peacetime sounds. Sounds from a world Harmon barely remembered. He thought about the men who weren't here. Sergeant Morrison, who'd been killed by a sniper outside Aachen. Lieutenant Chin, blown apart by a mine near the Siegfried Line. Private Davis, shot through the throat during a night patrol. Captain Williams, who'd led the company across the beach and died 3 weeks later in a hedgerow with his intestines in his hands. Thompson, Bradley, O'Connor, Zimmerman, Hayes. Names and faces that wouldn't stop appearing in Harmon's mind every time he closed his eyes. They should be here. They should be celebrating. They'd earned it more than anyone. But they were in graves scattered across France and Germany and Belgium, or they were listed as missing, or they were just gone, vaporized by artillery, burned beyond recognition, buried by explosions. Victory felt like theft. Like Harmon had taken something that belonged to better men. A Captain Harmon didn't know walked past, noticed him sitting alone. "You okay, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir." "Hell of a day, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." The captain sensed something but didn't push. "Get some rest. We'll have formation tomorrow to discuss occupation duties." He moved on. Occupation. That's what came next. They weren't going home immediately. First, they'd help rebuild what they destroyed. They'd supervise displaced persons camps, guard prisoners of war, maintain order in the chaos. The war was over, but the work wasn't. Harmon stood up. His legs were stiff. He'd been sitting on that running board for 2 hours without moving. The celebration in the street had evolved into chaos. Men were dancing. Someone was shooting flares. A fist fight had broken out near the bonfire but ended quickly with laughter. He walked away from it. Away from the noise and the light and the joy he couldn't share. He walked to the edge of the village where American supply trucks were parked in a muddy field. Sentries were posted but they weren't watching carefully. Everyone was distracted by the celebration. Harmon found a quiet spot between two trucks and sat down in the dirt. The ground was cold. It had rained the night before and the mud soaked through his uniform trousers. He didn't care. The sounds of celebration were muffled here. Distant. He could breathe. He pulled a photograph from his breast pocket. The edges were worn, the image faded from months of handling. It showed his younger brother, Michael, in his Navy uniform. The photograph had been taken before Michael shipped out to the Pacific. That was 2 years ago. Michael was 20. He'd written letters for the first few months, cheerful letters about shipboard life and exotic ports and how he couldn't wait to come home. Then the letters stopped. The telegram had arrived in January 1945. Michael's destroyer had been hit by a kamikaze off Luzon. Michael was listed as missing, presumed dead. Harmon's mother had written him the news. The letter was 8 pages long, mostly her trying to be strong, failing. At the end she'd added a single line in shaky handwriting, "At least I'll still have one son." Harmon folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his pocket. In the distance, fireworks erupted. Someone had found German signal flares and was launching them into the darkening sky. Red and green light burst overhead. The men cheered. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific continued. American soldiers and Marines were still dying on islands with unpronounceable names. American ships were still burning. American families were still receiving telegrams. Michael was still gone. Victory in Europe. Half a victory. Half his family. Harmon lay back in the mud and stared at the sky. The celebration sounds faded into background noise. He thought about tomorrow and the day after, and all the days stretching ahead when people would expect him to be grateful, to be happy, to move on. He thought about the faces of the dead that wouldn't leave his memory. He thought about home and whether he'd ever feel like he belonged there again. The war was over. Everyone was celebrating. And James Harmon sat alone in the mud, carrying a weight that victory hadn't lifted. 3 days after the German surrender, First Lieutenant James Harmon's company was ordered to establish a temporary command post in a town called Regensburg on the Danube River. The town had been bombed extensively but some buildings remained intact. The company occupied a former Wehrmacht administrative center, a 3-story stone building with blown-out windows and shell holes in the walls. The men were still celebrating. The euphoria hadn't faded yet. They discovered German beer in the basement and cigarettes in an abandoned quartermaster depot. Every night turned into a party. Every day felt like a holiday. The structure of military discipline loosened. Officers let it happen. After 11 months of combat, everyone deserved release. Harmon didn't participate. He worked. He filed reports. He supervised the establishment of supply lines for the occupation phase. He coordinated with civil affairs officers who were trying to restore basic services to German civilians. He kept busy. Movement helped. Thinking didn't. On May 10th, a Red Cross worker arrived at the command post. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 43 years old, from Boston, and she'd been in Europe since 1943. She'd seen Anzio and Monte Cassino and the camps. Her eyes held the same emptiness Harmon saw in his own reflection. She found him in what had been a Wehrmacht officer's office, sorting through captured documents that needed translation. "Lieutenant Harmon?" He looked up. "Yes, ma'am. I'm with Graves Registration. I need to discuss casualty documentation for your unit." She spoke in a flat, professional tone. This was work she'd done many times. "Of course. What do you need?" She sat down across from him. Her Red Cross uniform was clean but worn. "We're trying to account for every American serviceman killed in action between D-Day and the surrender. Your company suffered significant casualties. I need to verify some names." Harmon pulled out a file. "I have the official roster. 187 confirmed dead. 12 missing, presumed dead. 4 died in hospital after evacuation." Eleanor opened a notebook. "I'll need to cross-reference against the Graves registration records. Some soldiers were buried in temporary graves that need to be relocated to permanent cemeteries. Others were never recovered. For the next 3 hours they went through names. One by one. Alphabetically. Each name triggered a memory that Harmon had been trying to suppress. Adams Robert. Private First Class. Killed by artillery, August 3, 1944. Near Saint-Lô. He was 19. Eleanor made a note. Buried. Temporary grave marked with his dog tags. Map coordinates are in the file. Alan Thomas. Sergeant. Sniper. September 14th. Siegfried Line. He'd been with the company since training. He had 3 kids. Anderson William. Corporal. Landmine. October 2nd. Both legs severed. Bled out before we could get him to an aid station. Name after name. Death after death. Each one specific. Each one personal. Harmon's voice remained steady but his hands started shaking again. Eleanor noticed but didn't comment. They reached Morrison Daniel. Sergeant. Harmon stopped. He stared at the name on the page. Lieutenant. Eleanor said quietly. Morrison. Harmon's voice cracked. He was my platoon sergeant. Best NCO I ever served with. He was supposed to go home in November. His wife was pregnant. He got shot outside Aachen by a sniper we never found. He died in my arms. Last thing he said was, take care of my boys. He meant the platoon. Eleanor didn't write anything. She just waited. I didn't take care of them, Harmon said. Half of them are dead. That's not on you. Then who's it on? The words came out harder than Harmon intended. I was the officer. I gave the orders. I sent men into positions where they died. That's command. Eleanor closed her notebook. Lieutenant, I've been documenting casualties since Italy. I've talked to hundreds of officers. Every single one of them feels what you're feeling. Every single one thinks they could have done more. You know what I tell them? Harmon didn't respond. I tell them that war kills people. That's what war does. The only person responsible for these deaths is whoever started the war. You didn't start it. You fought it. You survived it. That's not a crime. Tell that to Morrison's wife. I'm sure she'd rather have you alive than have both of you dead. Harmon stood up abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor. We should finish this later. Eleanor stood too. Lieutenant, when's the last time you slept? I sleep. When's the last time you slept more than 2 hours? Harmon didn't answer. You need to talk to someone. There are psychiatric officers attached to the medical units. They've been trained to. I'm fine. You're not fine. Nobody who went through what you went through is fine. That's not weakness. That's reality. I'll be fine once I get home. Eleanor looked at him with an expression that was somehow both sympathetic and skeptical. Lieutenant, going home doesn't make this go away. It just means you'll be dealing with it without the structure of military routine. She picked up her notebook. I'll come back tomorrow to finish the list. Please think about talking to someone. Please. She left. Harmon sat back down. He looked at the casualty roster. 187 names. 187 lives. 187 families receiving telegrams. He thought about Morrison's wife, holding a baby that would never know its father. He thought about the letters he'd written to parents and wives and siblings, trying to explain how their loved ones had died heroically, when the truth was that most of them had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. That night, Harmon tried to sleep. He lay on a cot in a room with 3 other officers, all of whom were snoring peacefully. He closed his eyes. Immediately the images came. Not the combat images he expected, but something worse. The faces of the men from the casualty list. All 187 of them. Looking at him. Not accusing. Just present. He opened his eyes. His heart was racing. He was covered in sweat. The room felt too small. He got up and went outside. The night was cool. Spring in Bavaria. Stars overhead. Peaceful. Normal. The kind of night that existed before the war and would continue existing after it. But Harmon felt like he was watching it from behind glass. Present but separate. He walked through the town. Most of it was destroyed. Rubble-filled streets. Collapsed buildings. Civilians were starting to emerge from basements and shelters, beginning the slow process of rebuilding. They looked at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. Conqueror and conquered. Victor and vanquished. A German woman was pulling bricks from the ruins of what had been her home. She was maybe 60, wearing a threadbare coat. She worked methodically, stacking salvageable bricks in one pile, broken ones in another. She didn't look at Harmon as he passed. He thought about the German soldiers he'd killed. He didn't know how many. He'd stopped counting after France. Some had been young, teenagers in ill-fitting uniforms. Others had been older, men who'd probably fought in the previous war. Each one had a family somewhere. Each one had a mother who would receive a notification. Each one had been someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone's father. The war was over and everyone was celebrating because they'd won. But what exactly had they won? The right to go home? The privilege of survival? The satisfaction of defeating evil? All of those things were true, but they didn't feel like victory. They felt like relief. And relief wasn't the same thing. Harmon walked to the edge of town where the Danube flowed dark and silent. He stood on the riverbank and watched the water. Somewhere downstream was Austria. Somewhere beyond that was what remained of Hitler's empire. Destroyed. Defeated. Crushed. Millions dead. Cities turned to rubble. Families shattered. Survivors traumatized. Was that victory? Or was it just ending? He thought about the celebration on May 7th. The men firing rifles into the air. The singing and drinking and joy. He understood it intellectually. They'd survived something terrible and wanted to mark the moment. They deserved that. But he couldn't share it. Something inside him had changed during the war, had broken or hardened or just gone numb, and now he stood outside the human experiences of joy and relief and celebration. He stood by the river until dawn. When the sun rose he walked back to the command post. The other officers were still sleeping. He made coffee and returned to Morrison's office and resumed working through the casualty list. Eleanor returned that afternoon. They finished the documentation. 199 names total. Each one recorded. Each one filed. Each one reduced to a line in a ledger. When they finished, Eleanor said, "There's a service on Sunday. For the fallen. General's going to speak. You should come." "I'll be there." "Will you really?" Harmon didn't answer. Eleanor stood to leave, then paused. "Lieutenant, can I tell you something? Off the record." "Sure. I came to Europe because my son was killed at Kasserine Pass. He was 22. Tank crew. I couldn't save him, so I thought maybe I could help save someone else's son. For 2 years I've been documenting casualties and helping wounded soldiers and writing letters to families. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty. The worst thing you can do is carry this alone. The weight doesn't get lighter over time. It gets heavier. Unless you let someone help you carry it." She left. Harmon sat in the quiet office. Outside someone was singing. American voices, cheerful and young. The war was over. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone except the men who couldn't forget. June 1945. The euphoria of victory was fading into the routine of occupation. First Lieutenant James Harmon's company was reassigned to displaced persons camp administration near Munich. The work was grinding and bureaucratic, processing paperwork for refugees, supervising food distribution, maintaining order in the chaos. The men were getting restless. They wanted to go home. Everyone wanted to go home. The point system determined rotation. Service time, overseas time, combat time, decorations. High point men shipped out first. Low point men stayed in Germany watching their friends leave. Harmon had enough points to leave. He'd been overseas since May 1944. He'd earned a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He should have been on the first transport home. But he kept volunteering for duties that delayed his departure. Extra assignments. Administrative work. Anything to postpone the return. Other officers noticed. Captain Richards, the new company commander, called him in. "Jim, what are you doing?" "Sir? You have 127 points. You should be halfway across the Atlantic by now. Instead you're here processing DP camp registrations." "Why?" Harmon didn't have a good answer. "Someone needs to do it." "Someone, yes. But not you. You've done enough. Go home." "I'm not ready." Richards studied him. "You think you're going to be more ready in 6 months? A year? It doesn't work that way. The longer you stay here, the harder it gets." "I'm fine here." "You're not fine anywhere, Jim. That's the problem." Richards softened his tone. "Look, I'm going to be direct with you. You're a good officer. Good leader. Your men respect you. But you're running on empty. You need rest. You need distance from this. You need to go home." "What if I can't?" "Can't what?" "Get on a ship. Can't go back to being normal. Can't pretend this didn't happen. Can't sit at a dinner table and talk about the weather while people ask me what the war was like and expect a cheerful answer." Richards was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I learned in the Pacific before I transferred here? I learned that normal is a lie. There's no going back to who you were before. The war changed you. Changed all of us. The question isn't whether you can be the same person. You can't. The question is whether you can learn to be a different person who can still function in a world that didn't change. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I. But we're going to have to figure it out. Starting with you getting on a transport ship and going home." Richards signed a form. "You're shipping out next week. That's an order. Use the time to prepare yourself." Harmon left the office feeling like he'd been pushed toward a cliff. Home. Pennsylvania. His parents' farm. His old bedroom. The town where everyone knew him. The world that had continued existing while he'd been in another reality. He spent the next week trying to imagine it. Conversations with his mother. Meals with his father. Seeing his sister. Walking into church. Going to the general store. Normal activities that now felt impossible. The transport ship was called USS General W.G. Hahn. It departed Bremerhaven on June 17, 1945. The deck was crowded with soldiers heading home. Most were jubilant. They hung over the rails watching the German coast disappear, cheering as the homeland faded from view. Some were crying. Others were silent. Harmon stood away from the crowd. He watched Europe shrink into the horizon. He thought about all the places he'd been: Normandy, Saint-Lô, Aachen, the Siegfried Line, Bavaria. He thought about all the men buried in those places. He thought about how he was leaving them behind. The voyage took 8 days. Most men played cards or wrote letters or slept. Harmon walked the deck. He couldn't sleep anymore. 3, maybe 4 hours a night, interrupted by nightmares. The ship's doctor offered sleeping pills. Harmon refused. The pills made the nightmares worse. On the 4th day at sea, Harmon met another officer who couldn't sleep. Captain Thomas Brennan, 101st Airborne. He jumped into Normandy in Holland and survived Bastogne. He stood at the rail smoking a cigarette at 0300. "Can't sleep either?" Brennan said. No. How long? Since Dachau. Brennan nodded. I saw Landsberg. Different camp, same thing. They stood in silence for a while. The ocean was dark. The stars were bright. The ship's engines hummed steadily beneath their feet. You know what I can't figure out? Brennan said. How we're supposed to go back and act like everything's normal. Like we can just pick up where we left off. We can't, Harmon said. I know. But everyone expects us to. They're going to throw parades. Give speeches. Call us heroes. And we're supposed to smile and shake hands and say thank you and move on. What if we can't move on? Then we fake it. Brennan crushed his cigarette against the rail. That's what I've decided. I'm going to fake being okay until maybe one day I actually am okay. Or at least okay enough that people stop asking. That sounds exhausting. More exhausting than what we've already done? Harmon didn't answer. The ship arrived in New York on June 25th. The Statue of Liberty appeared through morning fog. The men on deck erupted in cheers. Some were weeping. The band on the dock was playing. Welcome home banners hung from the pier. Civilians waved American flags. It looked like every homecoming photograph Harmon had ever seen. He felt nothing. Processing took 6 hours. Medical checks. Forms. More forms. Discharge paperwork for some, reassignment orders for others. Harmon was being sent to Camp Kilmer for final processing before separation from service. He'd be a civilian within 2 weeks. The bus ride to Camp Kilmer took him through New Jersey. The landscape was green and peaceful. No bomb craters. No burned vehicles. No rubble. Just normal American suburbia. Neat houses with white fences, children playing in yards, women hanging laundry. Normal life. Felt alien. At Camp Kilmer, Harmon was assigned a bunk in a temporary barracks with 40 other returning officers. Most were excited about discharge. They talked about plans, college on the GI Bill, starting businesses, getting married, buying houses. The American dream, deferred by war, ready to resume. Harmon listened but didn't participate. He had no plans. He'd been accepted to law school before the war, but that felt like a different lifetime. That was when he'd been a different person. On his third night at Camp Kilmer, there was a mandatory briefing. A major from personnel spoke about transitioning to civilian life. He talked about job opportunities and educational benefits and how proud the nation was of their service. He made it sound easy, simple, straightforward. During the question period, someone asked, "What if we're having trouble adjusting?" The major smiled. "That's normal. Give it time. Stay busy. Focus on the future, not the past. You'll be fine." After the briefing, Harmon approached the major. "Sir, is there anyone here trained in combat fatigue? Psychiatric services." The major's smile faded slightly. "Are you having problems, Lieutenant? Difficulty sleeping? Nightmares? Anxiety? That's normal. Everyone experiences that initially. It'll pass once you get settled at home. What if it doesn't? Then see a civilian doctor. But honestly, Lieutenant, the best medicine is getting back to normal life. Or family. Routine. The Army can't solve problems that civilians are better equipped to handle." Harmon left the briefing feeling dismissed. The message was clear. The war was over, you survived, now move on. No support. No acknowledgement. Just, next. He received his discharge papers on July 3, 1945. Honorable discharge. First Lieutenant. Combat Infantry Badge. Silver Star. Bronze Star with V device. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Good Conduct Medal. European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 4 campaign stars. A list of decorations that looked impressive on paper and meant nothing to Harmon. He was given a train ticket to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. From there he'd take a bus to his hometown. He was going home. The train departed on July 4th. Independence Day. America's birthday. Perfect timing for a returning veteran. The train was crowded with soldiers all heading home. The mood was festive. Someone started singing. Others joined in. Harmon sat alone by a window and watched Pennsylvania roll past. Farmland. Small towns. Normal. Peaceful. Unchanged. The war hadn't touched this place. Life had continued here while men were dying in Europe. The bus from Harrisburg arrived in his hometown just before sunset. Population 3,200. The same as when he'd left. The main street looked exactly as he remembered. The hardware store, the diner, the barbershop, the church. Nothing had changed. His father was waiting at the bus stop. He looked older. Thinner. His hair had gone gray. He saw Harmon and his face did something complicated. Relief and grief and joy all mixed together. "Son," was all he said. They drove to the farm in silence. His mother was waiting on the porch. She ran to him before the truck had fully stopped. She hugged him so hard he could barely breathe. She was crying. She kept saying, "Thank God, thank God, thank God." His sister Beth hung back. She'd been 14 when he left. She was 16 now. She looked at him like he was a stranger. Inside, his mother had prepared his favorite meal. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie. The table was set with the good china. Everything was perfect. Everything was wrong. They sat down to eat. His parents asked careful questions. How was the voyage home? Was the food on the ship okay? Did he need anything? Nobody asked about the war. Nobody asked about France or Germany or what he'd seen. They wanted him home and whole and unchanged. They wanted him to be the boy who'd left in 1943. He wasn't that boy anymore. He'd never be that boy again. After dinner, his mother asked if he wanted to invite friends over. Everyone wants to see you, she said. The whole town's been waiting. Maybe tomorrow, Harmon said. I'm tired. Of course. You need rest. She smiled, but her eyes were worried. She could see something was wrong but didn't know what to ask. Harmon went to his old bedroom. It was exactly as he'd left it. High school trophies on the shelf. Photographs on the wall. Books he'd read as a teenager. A time capsule of innocence. He lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, fireworks were going off. Independence Day celebrations. The sound of explosions made him flinch. His heart raced. He forced himself to breathe slowly. This was home. He'd survived the war to reach this moment. He should be grateful. He should be happy. He felt nothing but the weight of the dead pressing down on him in the darkness. August 1945. James Harmon had been home for 5 weeks. The town had thrown him a parade, small but sincere. The mayor gave a speech. The high school band played. Children waved flags. People clapped. Harmon stood on a platform and smiled and accepted handshakes and tried to look like the hero they wanted him to be. The parade was on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, life had returned to normal for everyone except Harmon. The town moved on. They'd welcomed their hero home. Now they expected him to resume living. He couldn't. The gap between what was expected and what he was capable of grew wider each day. His mother invited neighbors for dinner. Harmon sat at the table while they asked questions he couldn't answer honestly. What was France like? Did you meet any generals? What was your most exciting experience? They wanted adventure stories. They wanted to hear about courage and victory and American superiority. They didn't want to hear about Morrison dying in his arms or the smell of Dachau or the nightmares that came every time he closed his eyes. So he lied. He told them France was beautiful. He told them the generals were impressive. He told them his most exciting experience was liberating a French village and being thanked by grateful civilians. He didn't tell them about the German teenager he'd shot in the throat, or the American private who'd stepped on a mine and lost both legs while screaming for his mother, or the empty feeling that never went away. People seemed satisfied with his answers. They nodded and smiled and said, "God bless you," and went home feeling good about supporting their troops. Harmon went to his room and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to fireworks in the distance that sounded like artillery. His father tried to help by putting him to work on the farm. "Hard work is good medicine," he said. "Keep your hands busy and your mind won't wander." Harmon tried. He worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, baling hay, maintaining equipment. The physical labor was exhausting. It didn't help. At night the memories came anyway. One afternoon in mid-August, while working in the barn, Harmon heard a car backfire on the road. The sound triggered something. Suddenly he was on the ground, heart pounding, looking for cover. His father found him there 5 minutes later, pressed against the barn wall, breathing hard. "Jim?" His father's voice was careful, concerned. Harmon stood up slowly. "I'm fine." "That didn't look fine. Just startled me." His father didn't push, but Harmon saw the worry deepen in his eyes. Word spread quickly in a small town. People started looking at him differently. Not with admiration anymore, but with something else. Concern. Pity. Fear. The local doctor suggested he see a specialist in Harrisburg. "Shell shock," he said quietly. "Some men get it worse than others. There are treatments." Harmon refused. Going to a psychiatrist felt like admitting defeat. Like confirming what everyone was starting to suspect, that he'd come back broken. In early September, his mother convinced him to attend church. "The community wants to see you," she said. "It'll be good for you." The service was exactly as Harmon remembered. The same hymns. The same wooden pews. The same stained glass windows. The pastor delivered a sermon about gratitude and blessing and how God had protected America's soldiers and granted them victory over evil. Harmon sat in the back row and listened to the pastor talk about divine providence and American righteousness. He thought about the 19-year-old German soldier he'd shot outside Aachen, who'd been carrying a photograph of his family in his pocket. He thought about the chaplain from his division who'd been killed by a random artillery shell while conducting a service. He thought about the questions he'd stopped asking because the answers were too terrible. After the service, people approached him with the same questions and the same expectations. He gave the same rehearsed answers. Everyone seemed satisfied except his sister, Beth, who watched him from a distance with an expression that was somehow both sympathetic and sad. Later at home she found him sitting on the back porch. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said quietly. "I'm not pretending." "Yes you are. You've been pretending since you got home." Harmon didn't respond. Beth sat down next to him. I'm not a kid anymore, Jim. I can see you're not okay. Nobody's okay after a war. I didn't know Michael very well, she said. She was crying now. He left when I was 12. I have more memories of him being gone than being here. But you, I remember you. And you're not you anymore. People change. Not like this. She wiped her eyes. Mom and Dad don't want to see it because they're afraid. But I see it. You're still fighting the war, aren't you? Harmon looked at his sister. She was 16 years old, but her eyes held an understanding that most adults didn't have. The war had changed everyone, even the ones who'd stayed home. I don't know how to stop, he admitted. Maybe you don't need to stop. Maybe you just need to learn to live with it. How? I don't know. But pretending it's not there isn't working. She was right. The pretending was exhausting. More exhausting than the war had been. At least in combat, the threat was external and obvious. At home, the threat was internal and invisible, and there was no one to fight except himself. That night, Harmon made a decision. He couldn't go back to law school. He couldn't settle into the normal life everyone expected. He needed something different. Something that acknowledged what he'd been through instead of asking him to forget it. He started writing. Not a diary, he tried that and it didn't help. Instead, he wrote letters to the families of the men who died under his command. Honest letters. Letters that told the truth about how their sons and husbands and brothers had died. Letters that honored their sacrifice without lies about glory or heroism. He wrote to Morrison's widow. Told her about how her husband had died trying to save a wounded private. Told her about how Morrison had talked about her and the baby every night. Told her about how Morrison had been the best NCO he'd ever known. He wrote to the parents of Private Davis, who'd been killed by a sniper. Told them their son had been brave and kind and that the last thing he'd said was, "Tell my folks I love them." He wrote to the wife of Captain Williams. Told her about how her husband had led the company across Omaha Beach and through France with courage and compassion. Letter after letter. Name after name. Each one painful to write. Each one necessary. Some families wrote back. They thanked him for the truth. They asked questions. They shared their own grief. A few said his letters helped them understand what their loved ones had gone through. A few said it made the loss harder to bear. Most said both. The writing didn't cure anything, but it helped. It gave Harmon a purpose. A way to honor the dead that felt more real than parades or speeches or newspaper articles. In October, on what would have been Michael's 21st birthday, Harmon's parents held a small memorial service. Just family. They planted a tree in the backyard and placed a stone marker beneath it. In memory of Michael James Harmon, 1924 to 1945. Beloved son and brother. Harmon stood by the marker and thought about the last conversation he'd had with his brother. It had been in 1943 before Michael shipped out. They'd been sitting on this same porch talking about what they'd do after the war. Michael wanted to study engineering. Harmon wanted to practice law. They'd made plans. Made promises to stay in touch. Made assumptions that they'd both survive. The war had broken all those plans. Broken all those promises. Proven all those assumptions wrong. His mother put her hand on his shoulder. "Do you think he suffered?" she asked quietly. Harmon didn't know. The telegram had said, "Missing, presumed killed in action." No details. No body. Just absence. "I hope not," he said. It was the only comfort he could offer. November came. Then December. The first Christmas since the war ended. The town was decorated. Stores displayed cheerful signs about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Everyone was celebrating the first Christmas without the war hanging over them. Harmon spent Christmas Eve in his room, writing another letter to another grieving family. Outside, people were singing carols. Inside, he was trying to find words to explain how their son had died. His mother knocked on the door. "Jim? We're about to open presents. I'll be down in a minute." She paused. "Are you writing those letters again?" "Yes. It's Christmas Eve. Can't it wait? They've been waiting months. They deserve answers." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know you can't bring them back, right? No matter how many letters you write." "I know. Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because somebody has to remember them. Somebody has to tell their families the truth. And it has to be me because I was there when they died." His mother left. Harmon finished the letter. Then he went downstairs and pretended to enjoy Christmas with his family. The new year came. 1946. A year of peace. A year of rebuilding. A year of moving forward. Except Harmon wasn't moving forward. He was stuck in 1944 in France, in the hedgerows and the mud and the noise, watching Morrison die over and over and over again. In March 1946, he received a letter from Captain Richards, his former company commander. Richards had stayed in the army. He was stationed in Germany helping with occupation duties. He wrote about the work, about the challenges of rebuilding, about the displaced persons still waiting for homes. At the end of the letter, Richards wrote, "I know a dozen officers who came home and can't adjust. Good men. Competent leaders. Completely lost in civilian life. Some are drinking. Some can't hold jobs. Some are hurting their families without meaning to. I don't have solutions for them. I don't have solutions for myself. But I can tell you this, you're not alone. Whatever you're feeling, however hard it is, you're not the only one. Harmon read that letter 3 times. Then he put it in a drawer with the responses from grieving families. Evidence that he wasn't insane. That what he was feeling was real. That the war hadn't ended just because the guns stopped firing. One afternoon in late March, Harmon was working in the barn when Beth came running up the path. She was holding a newspaper. "Jim, you need to see this." It was a story about a veterans organization forming in Washington. They were advocating for mental health services for returning soldiers. They were pushing Congress to recognize what they called war neurosis as a legitimate medical condition. They were fighting to establish VA hospitals with psychiatric care. "You should contact them," Beth said. "They're helping people like you." "People like me?" "People who came back changed. People who need help." Harmon looked at the article. Names and addresses of organizers. A phone number. Information about support groups forming across the country. For the first time since coming home, he felt something like hope. Not that the pain would go away. Not that he'd ever be the person he'd been before the war. But that maybe there was a way to live with what had happened. A way to carry the weight without being crushed by it. He called the number. A woman answered. He explained who he was. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "We have a group meeting in Harrisburg next Thursday. Can you make it?" He could make it. The meeting was in a church basement. 15 men. All veterans. All struggling. They sat in a circle and talked. Not about heroism or victory or glory. About nightmares and anger and guilt and the unbearable gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. For the first time since coming home, Harmon told the truth about the war. About Morrison. About Dachau. About the faces of the dead that wouldn't leave his memory. About the weight he carried every day. Nobody thanked him for his service. Nobody told him he was a hero. Nobody said it would get better. Instead they said, "Me too." And somehow, that was more helpful than everything else combined. James Harmon lived until 1993. He never fully recovered from the war. The nightmares continued. The weight of the dead remained. But he learned to function despite them. He married. He had children. He worked as a teacher. He spent 50 years attending veterans meetings and helping other men who came back changed. He wrote 187 letters to the families of the men who died under his command. Some were never answered. Some sparked decades-long correspondence. All were necessary. He never went to a VE Day celebration. Never attended a reunion. Never gave speeches about the war. When people asked him about it, he told them it was complicated. Most accepted that answer. A few understood what he really meant. On his deathbed, surrounded by family, he asked his daughter to read the names of the men from his company who hadn't come home. All 187 of them. It took 20 minutes. When she finished, he closed his eyes. His last words were, "I remembered them." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For James Harmon, it never really ended at all. He just learned to live with it still happening somewhere inside him, in a place where victory didn't exist and the dead were always present and celebration was impossible. He wasn't the only soldier who couldn't celebrate victory. He was just one of the ones who survived long enough to understand why. That understanding was its own kind of burden. Its own kind of weight. Its own kind of war that continued long after the parades ended and the crowds went home and the world moved on. Some wars end on a battlefield. Others end in a quiet room decades later, with a list of names that nobody else remembers. Both are real. Both matter. Both deserve to be told.